Investigators now say the suspect in Monday's attack at Ohio State University acted alone when he plowed into a crowd and attacked people with a butcher's knife. The FBI says he was inspired by ISIS propaganda. The question is, how did he go from refugee to ISIS sympathizer in 2 years? Well, in August of this year, Abdul Razak Ali Arden was quoted in the Ohio State student newspaper complaining about Islamophobia. He said this: "I'm a Muslim. It's not what the media portrays me to be. If people looking at me, a Muslim praying, I don't know what they're going to think, what's going to happen." Well, some, like our next guest, Ng Abdul Qadir from Georgetown University, argue this fear and alienation can lead to radicalization. Professor Abdul Qadir joins us now. Professor, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote a piece about this earlier this year, long before this attack, but basically arguing that Islamophobia, dislike or fear of Muslims, is one of the drivers of terrorism. And you said this: "What can we do about the tiny fraction of Muslims committing such unspeakable violence we saw in San Bernardino, Paris, and Brussels?" You don't address problems within the religion or the Islamic community. You turn it instead back on America and the West by saying our intolerance causes this. Am I misreading your point?
I think it's complicated, right? So I think at the outset we need to make clear that there's never a justification for a tragedy such as this one, right? So irrespective of the fact that someone may have suffered from bigotry or discrimination on account of their religious identity, that doesn't justify taking matters into your own hand and perpetrating or inflicting violence on professors and students or innocent civilians more generally. By the same token, I think with respect to the article that you're referencing, I was actually relying on research that came out of Stanford University that showed that essentially anti-Muslim bigotry and discrimination, or what we commonly refer to as Islamophobia, can contribute to a sense of what they term as cultural homelessness. This idea, particularly for newcomers, for immigrants to this country, where they don't necessarily feel that they identify with their home country where they originally came from, and they also feel alienated from their new host country.
Right.
So in this case, the United States of America.
But you can see why this looks a lot like victim blaming. So you've had an awful lot of Americans killed and injured by Islamic terror in the past 8 years. A lot, almost 100 killed, 350 or more injured. And you're basically saying that that happened because America is not hospitable enough to Muslims, and that seems unfair.
Absolutely not. First, I think we need to take a step back and understand that there's actually a greater threat of terrorism from white supremacist groups and right-wing extremists than there are from individuals who self-identify as Muslim.
Well, that's just not true.
Actually,
no, it's not. There haven't been 100 Americans killed in the last 8 years, 350 wounded from right-wing extremists in the United States. That's not true. And if you claim it is, I'd ask you to cite your source.
The FBI. So according to the FBI data indicates that there have been more acts of terrorism committed by right-wing extremists and white supremacists. In addition to that, last year, Duke University...
In the last 8 years, there have been 100 or more than 100 people killed by white supremacists and more than 350 wounded by white supremacists in America. That's not true.
So I'm referring to the number of acts of domestic terrorism as opposed to victims. So
look, I mean, obviously you're making a point that is unsupportable. I'm talking about actual acts of terrorism. People die, people get wounded. I mean, we can define terrorism in many different ways. I'm just saying you've had an awful lot of people killed by Islamic extremists, and what I hear you saying is we're not going to take a moment to reflect upon why this is happening within our community, but instead we're going to look at the larger community and blame them. That's what I see happening.
That's unfortunate. You know, first, it is important to understand that the data that I'm relying on comes from law enforcement, specifically the FBI, as well as elite academic institutions such as Duke University.
But what does it mean? I mean, okay, so let's say there are 10,000 right-wing extremist terrorist acts every day. It still doesn't answer the question, why are people coming to this country in the name of Islam killing Americans? And don't you think you should pause for a minute and reflect on what's gone wrong within your community?
I don't think anything has gone wrong in my community. You know, first of all, there are about 3 to 7 million Muslim Americans in this country, and the individual who perpetrated this atrocity at this university is far from representative of that 3 to 7 million.
Well, I don't think he is either, and I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying I'm an Episcopalian, and if you saw 100 people murdered by Episcopalians in the name of the Archbishop of Canterbury in the last 8 years, a lot of us at church would be saying, what the hell is this?
So
what can we do to stop it?
Right, and so let's take a moment to reflect upon that. When there are extremists that perpetrate a bombing at an abortion clinic in the name of Christianity, as Americans, we know enough about Christians and Christianity to sort of place a psychological space between that act that was committed by that individual and the rest of the population.
I'm sorry, I can't take that seriously. The scale is just not proportionate or comparable at all.
I would disagree with you. I think that the numbers say something different.
I actually wrote a whole book on crime. I know what the numbers are. It's not even close. It's not even close. Are you really telling me that there's no soul searching that you think Muslim Americans have to go through?
I think it's important to realize that Muslim Americans are your doctors, they're your teachers, they're your politicians, they're your nurses.
But a tiny percentage are also your terrorists. So why is this happening? It's not just the fault of white Americans. That's what you're saying.
So why is it that the conversation and the narrative focuses solely and exclusively on those individuals who are criminals as opposed to the vast population who are peaceful and contributing positively to this
Look, I get your defensiveness. I get that decent Muslim Americans feel under attack. They feel like they're being unfairly portrayed as terrorists. I understand all that. But at some point, you have to say, this really is a real problem, and it's discrediting all of us. And until we take it seriously, it's going to continue, no?
I think the community has been taking it seriously. I think that research actually shows that the community is very much involved in self-policing. They are very much involved in, cooperating with law enforcement officials and providing tips to them. In fact, the research shows that the majority of tips, that law enforcement officials receive about terrorist plots come from Muslim Americans.
Okay. I would suggest more soul. Something's going wrong, and I think it's important to be honest about it. We are out of time, unfortunately, but I appreciate your coming on.
Thank you.